get started. Welcome to the lecture series. Tonight we have Melissa Gabrielson. She's going to talk about spectacled eiders. She's with the U.S. Forest Service now, but she was working with the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge and was specializing on spectacled eiders. So she's going to talk about that. Here's Melissa.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the refuge itself and cover some of the cool aspects of it, and then we'll move into some of the research I was involved in being a sea duck biologist for them. So to start off, Yukon Delta is one of 16 refuges that is found within Alaska, and it is located in the southwest portion of the state. So this is Yukon Delta right here. It is actually the largest refuge in the state, nearly 22 million acres in size. And let's see, yeah, it's about the size of South Carolina. So if you can imagine the size of the state of South Carolina, that's about the same size that Yukon Delta is. So to go over just like a brief history of Yukon Delta, it was first established in 1909 by Theodore Roosevelt, who came over and founded the Yukon Delta Federal Bird Reservation. And then after that, a couple of small little satellite refuges started to form. One was Clarence Road National Wildlife Refuge, which is a pretty common, people kind of associate this area with that refuge. And in the 1980s, what ended up happening under ANILCA is all these small refuges were kind of combined together to form the boundaries that we see today. So this is the boundary of Yukon Delta as it stands right now. So the headquarters are located in Bethel, Alaska, which has a population of about 6,500 people, which people are kind of astonished at. They seem to think that Bethel is a lot smaller than even Cordova, but it's actually quite large. And the refuge itself is tailoring to that community and then about 50 other surrounding native villages. So the predominant people there are the Yupik Eskimos, and so they have this really large cultural tie to the resources of the refuge. So one of the main purposes of the refuge is to support that subsistence lifestyle while still meeting the refuge purposes. There are 2 wilderness areas located within the refuge boundaries. The first is located up here. This is the Andrewski Wilderness. And then we also had the Nunavik Island Wilderness, which is located right here. So the Andrewski Wilderness is 1.3 million acres in size. And the predominant landscape there are these rolling hills, which they call the Nulato Hills. And the elevation ranges in size anywhere from 1,000 feet to 3,000 feet in elevation. And the really cool thing about this area is that there's bristle-thighed curlews. And the bristle-thighed curlew only nests in western Alaska. And so 60% of the breeding population is actually found within the refuge borders. And then pretty much the entire population and a lot of the young of the year are using the refuge as a staging area as they're moving through to their wintering grounds. So the second wilderness area is located on Nunavik Island, and it's pretty much this entire southern portion of the island. So it's approximately 600,000 acres of wilderness. And it's most well known for its muskox population. But it's also super important for species such as reindeer and caribou, which use the upland plateaus in the wilderness area. And it's also really, really important for seabirds that are using the cliffs of the shorelines, and then also for sea ducks and other waterbird species that are coming into their lagoons and bays. They're full of eelgrass, and the birds just love those areas. So really important for staging birds. Oops. So back to Yukon Delta itself, it's over 50% water, and it has the Yukon River and the Kuskokwim River that run through it. And those 2 river sources are actually what's contributed to the overall landscape of the refuge, which is this broad, flat, treeless delta. And so 70% of the refuge is going to look like this. And it tends to be these sedge meadows, and they're kind of boggy areas. and then they're underlain by permafrost. The refuge also does have some forested areas. It's about 5%, and they're mostly going to be found around the Yukon River, the Kuskokwim River, then some of the other smaller tributaries. And it's predominantly going to be black spruce or some sort of black spruce hardwood forest. But the really super productive area on the refuge is actually its coastal zone. And this area is really important for millions of shorebirds that come here to breed and stage, and it's also really important for millions of waterbird species that come here to nest every year. So the refuge supports a really large aggregation of waterbirds every year. It can be 2 to 3 million birds that are coming and using this area on an annual basis. And that's going to include 90% of the cackling Canada geese. Also 90% of the white-fronted geese or speckled bellies. There's also emperor geese and Pacific black brant. So we've got all 4 of the geese species that are using the Yukon Delta's coastal zone. We've also got 45% of the pintail. And we've got 75% of the tundra swans. There's about 40,000 loons. This is a red-throated loon that's sitting on its nest. They're actually quite creepy how they sit there like that. We also have Pacific loons that are using the area as well, but the red throats are a little more common and easily spotted. And then we've got about 30,000 cranes that are coming to the Yukon Delta every year in the spring to nest. Okay. And then there's millions of shorebirds that are using this area, just like the Copper River Delta here. This is a really important breeding and staging area for a lot of these birds that are either staying there, like I said, to breed, or they're migrating through. So really important. This is a huge group of dunlin that just happened to be in the area. We've got 19 different species of raptors. This is a picture of a little gyr falcon that they found on one of their surveys that they were conducting in the Killabuk Mountains. He doesn't seem like he's too happy for them to be around, but there's a lot of goshawks, golden eagles, gyr falcon, and then snowy owl and northern hawk owl are some of the main species that are found within the refuge borders. Even though the refuge is predominantly known for its waterfowl and shorebird habitat, it's also really important for muskox and caribou and bear and moose species, which are all being surveyed to make sure that their populations are healthy. The refuge is also has internationally significant salmon fisheries, and it provides habitat for around 35 different species of fish. There are also 2 threatened species on the refuge. One is the Steller's eider, which was listed as threatened in 1997 due to a decrease in its breeding population numbers. And recently, in the last couple of years, they've actually talked about reintroducing the species to the Yukon Delta. The main reason being that there's stipulations in the recovery plan where the 2 main breeding areas in Alaska, which would be the Yukon Delta and then the North Slope, have got to meet very specific criteria. And right now, historically, there were Steller's eiders on the Yukon Delta, but now they're kind of sparse. I mean, we've been seeing them in most recent years, but we don't have a really stable population there. So in order for them to ever be recovered, there's going to have to be this population that's viable and sustainable over the next 10, 20, however long that the Steller's eiders are going to be around. So reintroduction is a big topic that's going to be coming up for the refuge here in the next couple of years. But the eider of the evening is going to be the spectacle eider. It is also a threatened species, but it was listed as threatened in 1993 due to a drastic decrease in its breeding population size. So between 1970 and 1993, they actually saw a 96% decrease in the breeding numbers within Western Alaska. So that's one of the reasons why the species was listed. And when the species was listed, they formed a recovery team. And it became this recovery team's responsibility to set up a list of criteria that had to be met in order for the species to be delisted. But they also had to come up with questions that needed to be answered about this species. And when the species was first put on the list as threatened, there wasn't very much known about it. They had no idea where it was wintering. They had no idea what kind of habitats it was using. So there were a lot of questions that needed to be identified. The main ones being, why did it decline? So one of the things that they came up with in their research was that lead poisoning was one of the reasons why this species was on the decline. And in the mid-90s, they did a bunch of surveys and they actually took x-rays of the eiders. And what they were finding was that lead shot had been deposited in the habitats that the eiders were using, and they were actually ingesting the pellets. And then from the pellets, they would sit there in their gizzards and kind of just, I guess, fester, and it would get into their bloodstreams and it would poison the birds, and eventually they would die. So this was a really big concern. The other issue was predation, which is kind of a constant struggle. Obviously, if there's a really high predator year and it put a lot of stress on the population, there's going to be some concern. But obviously, there's some natural ebb and flows that are going to happen. But this is an area where there's still a lot of unknowns about what's actually happening between predator and prey and what those dynamics are. And then the other reason for the decline was thought to be human disturbance. So that was through ATV use and environmental contamination, but it was also of harvesting of adult birds and then actually collecting eggs. So conservation measures were put into place after the species was listed as threatened, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service then banned the use of lead shot, and under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Endangered Species Act, they made it impossible, well not impossible, but they made it illegal for people to hunt eiders or to collect their eggs. And then a really big effort was put into place to start to research the species and find out as much as we possibly could about it and why these population declines were happening, if they were still happening, and just, you know, furthering the research on the species. So this is the spectacled eider, and it's an adult female. And you can see why they're called spectacled, because they have these rings around their eyes and make it look like they're actually wearing a pair of glasses. And they're a sea duck species. So typical of other sea duck species, they're extremely long-lived. So we had females that we had been monitoring, and they've been alive for 26 or more years, and they're still breeding. So they're, you know, extremely long-lived. I mean, we're not really sure how long they live, but obviously a long time. And like other sea duck species, they actually are delayed in their breeding process, so they're not going to breed until they're 2 or 3 years of age, and sometimes it can be a little bit longer, just depending upon the health of the bird. So they are adapted to live in both a marine and a freshwater habitat, and the spectacled eider is kind of unique because it's living in a marine habitat for pretty much its entire life. The only time it's not in a marine habitat is when it's breeding. So 2 to 3 months out of the year, so 9 to 11 months out of the year, they are in a marine environment. And so one of the adaptations that they have is they have a salt gland, and the salt gland allows the bird to excrete any extra salts that might be building up in its body so that it can live in the harsh marine environment for extended periods of time. So this is kind of a messy slide, but the main point was to point out that there's 3 breeding populations of eiders. So we have Arctic Russia, we have Barrow, and then we have Yukon Delta. And again, just like with the Steller's eiders, it's really important because as far as delisting goes, all 3 breeding areas have got to meet the criteria in order for the bird to be delisted. So until sometime in like the mid-90s, they had no idea where the eiders were going. And what they ended up finding was that they are in the wintertime, and what they found out was that they're going out into the middle of the Bering Sea, and the whole entire population, so all of the eiders from Russia and all of the eiders from Alaska are coming south of St. Lawrence Island, and they're all meeting up for the winter. And what's really crazy about this environment is that in December the ice starts to form, and so the predominant landscape out there are going to be these huge sheets of ice. And so they're living in some pretty extreme, harsh environments. And where the eiders tend to congregate are in leads, so they're in the open water in between the huge packs of ice. And one of the reasons why this is that's where the food source is going to be, is in that open water. But the packs of ice are going to serve as roosting areas for them, so they can actually get up out of the water and conserve energy. Because if you're sitting in super cold water for extended periods of time, obviously your energy is going to be depleted quite quickly. So after they've been sitting out on the ice for 9 months, they'll start to head back to their breeding area. And this usually occurs sometime in early May, early to mid-May. It just kind of depends upon the ice year. And the females and the males are going to show up and they're going to be paired. And then it's going to be the female's responsibility to find the nesting site. And females tend to like little small islands and ponds, peninsulas, and shorelines. So those are the areas that we typically find the eiders in. This is a spectacle eider nest, which is made out of grass, and then as she starts to lay eggs and incubate, she'll start to fill it with down. And they're typically going to have anywhere between 3 and 5 eggs. We've had females with as many as 9, but it typically is 3 to 5, and they're going to lay 1 egg a day. And then after about the 2nd or 3rd egg, they'll start to incubate, and they'll incubate for 24 days. So something that's kind of yucky, they have beautiful eggs. They're this beautiful green color, but one of their defense mechanisms is to poop on the nest. And so we have to, get in. We're kind of monitoring the nest and stuff, and so it can be like a really stinky, messy situation. But 24 days later, this is what you get, a cute little spectacle eider. And you can already see, this guy's only 2 or 3 days old, and he's already showing the signs of that spectacle there. And by 2 days of age, they're able to walk and swim, and they're able to feed themselves. And then after about 2 months is when they're going to start fledging, and they're going to start moving to that marine environment. And then again, it'll be 3 years before they start breeding and coming back to the areas where they were born.
Do they stay with their parents during this whole time?
It varies. They do at times, but what will happen is when the females come back, the immatures tend to hang out in other areas, but they'll be in a similar area, but like when the female's nesting, the other young aren't with her. They're somewhere else, but they're usually within the area somewhere. So there are a few predators. One is Arctic fox. There's also red fox, and then yaters and gulls. And so this is a picture of a gull eating a scop baby. He just completely gobbled it up in one gulp there. But the main issue is that, obviously there's going to be predator-prey cycles. And we need to understand these cycles a lot better. We can't just, destroy fox or destroy gulls because they're eating ducklings and eggs and things like that, because that's a natural thing for them to do. So what we decided to do was we put out some trail cams, and we put these on active Arctic fox dens, if we found one. And there were a couple of years where we had dens on the island that I was researching. And so we would put these cameras out on the active den sites, and what we were looking for was what kind of activities were going on, what were they doing, what kind of food were they bringing back. So one of the things that they typically did was maintenance of the den itself. So the adults were constantly redigging out holes, making their holes to the dens bigger, and they were expanding the dens, and so there was maintenance, and then there was also this behavioral component where the female, especially the female, the father, the dad or male figure tended to be the one that went out and collected the food and was bringing stuff back to the den site, where the female was the one that was interacting with the kids as they were getting older and starting to teach them different behaviors. Then the other thing we wanted to look at was what exactly were they eating. And so we were doing this through the footage of the cameras, but then we would also actually go to the den sites and look around and see if we, what kind of wings we were finding, or feet, or heads, or whatever it ended up being, to kind of get a grasp on exactly what were they focusing on, if they were focusing on anything. So the study area that I was stationed at is a place called Kikigak Island, and it's located on the coastal zone of the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge. And this is a 32-kilometer square island, and it's separated from the mainland by a river that's called the Ninglik River, and then which is on the eastern side of the island, and on the western side of the island we were open to the Bering Sea. Then on the southern part of the island, we could actually see another island, which is called Nelson Island. And this was pretty much the only landscape that's really, I mean, this was like our, what's the word I'm looking for? It's the only landscape out there. Everything's like so flat. So we knew that if we could see Nelson Island, that we were looking to the south. And that's all that really mattered for the most part. But the island is pretty much these sedge meadows that are just interspersed with all these different sized, weirdly shaped ponds. And there are a few areas on the island that were elevated, these terraces that were maybe 4 to 6 feet difference in height, and those tended to be more of a tundra type of a habitat, a lot more shrubby species and berries and some of those typical species that you would find in a tundra type habitat, where the rest of the island was this amazing lush sedge meadow. The island was tidally influenced. There were a number of large sloughs that cut up through the island and then would influence the surrounding areas around them. And the island was susceptible to storm tides. So in November and sometimes in April, they could get these crazy storms. And in 2011, I believe it was, we actually had a really severe storm that the ocean ended up washing over the entire island, and it went inland 13 miles. And so events like that are obviously having some sort of effect on the water regime and the dynamics of the coastal zones. So we try to initiate some research to try to document these types of events that were happening. But the main reason that we were out there was so that we could monitor spectacled eiders. And the research out there has been going on for over 20 years, where they're documenting they're documenting adult survival, duckling survival, nest success, and then recruitment. So how many birds are coming back into the population. So this is our camp. The crew ranged anywhere in size from 4 to 6 people. 4 was kind of optimum because we only had so much space. But we lived out of a weather port, and then everybody had their own little individual tent. And the camps are located on those terraces, so they were a little bit higher up in elevation. And we got to the camp by using float planes. It kind of depended upon the time of year when we went out there, but typically we were going out after breakup, and so we could use float planes. If we went out earlier in the spring because we wanted to do bee-sighting, or if we wanted to document the migration of the birds coming onto the island, we would go out with planes on skis, or we would swing all of our stuff in with helicopters. So we tended to be out in the field for 6 weeks at a time, and so there were a lot of logistics, and there was a lot of planning involved. And so, you know, I did a lot of food prep was the big one. But there were times where, you know, we ran out of items, or, you know, we really were craving something, and so we would get resupplies by airdrop. The only thing is they couldn't figure out how to airdrop milk or eggs without breaking stuff. So we didn't get a lot of, you know, but anything that was non-breakable, mail, and, you know, fresh veggies and things like that, we could get via airdrop. So this is Kikigak yet again, and these are the plots that we're monitoring. So there's 45 plots located across the island, and we're going to be looking, we're going to be thoroughly searching these plots. And we're looking for speck eiders, and we're also looking for common eiders. And so with the speck eiders, what ends up happening is we try to search the plots twice, thoroughly. It doesn't always happen due to time frame issues and stuff like that and other projects that are going on, but we'll usually go through the plot at least once. And the 3 things that we're interested in are the female, is she marked or not, and the eggs, and then also in the nest. So with the females, banding has been happening on Kikigak since 1992. And they've marked females with metal bands and then tarsal bands, which are that bright yellow color with black markings on them. And then they also get a nasal disc, which goes right through their nose cavity. And so what we have been trying to do since they've been banded since 1992, we try to recite the females. So if we can identify them, we try to identify them. And we also want to see if there's any, females that aren't banded, because if they aren't banded, we want to get them into that population to start documenting their success. So we're going to try to recite if we can. So with this female, we were able to read her tarsal band from this photograph. And then we're going to be looking at the nests and the eggs within the nest. And so each egg is given an individual number, and then on subsequent visits, we're going to come back and we're going to document the egg status. So have any new eggs, has she laid any new eggs? Are there any eggs missing? Is there an egg that's cracked? So we're looking at that type of information. And then we'll look at overall nest, the overall nest status. Has it been depredated? Has she abandoned it? Is it successful? We're also going to age the eggs. And there's two ways that we age the eggs. One is that we put the eggs in water, and depending upon how the egg floats and where it's at in the water column, we can actually get an estimate on how old the egg is. The other way that we age eggs is by candling, and that requires using a tube of some kind that you put up to your eye, and then you take the egg and you actually hold the egg on the other side of the tube, and when you hold it up to the light, you can actually see through the egg. And these are the images that you see. I mean, it's really hard to do, and it takes a while to figure it out, but it's a really good way to estimate the age of the egg. And the reason why we're aging the eggs is because we want to know when can we trap females. If we need to trap a female, when can we do it? And there's a really small time frame in which we can do that. And it's usually a couple of days before hatch. The reason being that, one, she's going to be sitting super, super tight onto the nest because she's getting, the babies, it's really close for the babies to hatch. And two, she's going to be less likely to abandon because she's put so much effort into the nest that if we do trap her, she should come right back without anything happening to the nest. So there's two ways that we trap the birds. One is by using a mist net, which is kind of a weird way to trap a bird. But we take the mist net and we spread it between two people so it's nice and tight, and then you walk towards the bird that's sitting on her nest. And when you get in line with the bird on her nest, you actually just drop the net down on top of her, and she'll just pop right off the nest right into the net. The other way that we trap eiders is by using a bow trap. And it's called that because it's in this bow shape. And this is actually an emperor goose's nest. So it's not the best example, but with the eiders, what you end up doing is you actually remove their eggs from the nest, and we put fake eggs in there because we don't want them to get damaged in any way. We don't want them to be broken or have anything happen to them. So we'll actually remove the eggs, put in fake eggs, and then you cover the nest up so that it's camouflaged. And then what you do is there's a trigger, which is just a nail, and that's attached to a super long line, so it's like 100 feet. So you just drag the line out, and then you sit and you wait, and you wait, and you wait until the female decides that it's okay to come back onto her nest. And she'll get on her nest, and she'll get all nice and cozy, and then you pull the string, and the bow trap will snap over top of her, and she's caught. So this is one of the eiders that we ended up capturing. And you can see that she's not banded, and she doesn't have a nasal disc anyway. And so what will end up happening with the birds once we capture them is that we'll go through a bunch of measurements. We weigh the female to find her total weight, and then we'll take a tarsal measurement, which is her leg, a portion of her leg, and then we measure her nose, her culmen. And then she'll be given a metal band, a tarsal band, and a nasal disc. Or if she already has, a metal band and a tarsal band, we usually just kind of let them be. So, and we'll replace any bands and things like that if they need to be. So all of this nest searching and trapping, it's all occurring in the month of June. So at the end of June, everything's pretty much hatched. and there's lots of little babies running around, and what we'll do is we'll go through one more time and we'll check all the nests that we found initially, and we'll do a final nest status. So in this case, this is a spectacled eider nest that was successful. We can see that there's at least 3, probably 4 or 5 membranes in the nest. So because there's that membrane, we know that it was successful. Then we'll come back later in July and we'll do brood captures. And in July, the birds are going to be about 30 to 35 days of age, and we just walk the islands looking for broods. And when we find one, we'll set up a mist net again in a pond. And then we'll just push the broods gently into the mist net. They'll get tangled up, and then we'll, again, take measurements. So with the ducklings, the only thing that's different is that we actually measure their 9th primary, which will give us an age estimate on the bird. And they only get a metal band. And then the adult females will be measured again with their weight, culmen, and tarsus. And we'll be given any bands if they need them. So there's 2 reasons why we're doing the brood captures. One is to look at recruitment, so who's coming back to the island, and then 2, we're looking at duckling health and duckling survival. So there are a couple other projects that we initiated when I was working there, and one of them was a grad student project. And we have a lot of questions about habitat and how it relates to the eiders, and if there's anything going on with invertebrates, you know, what are they eating? Does salinity have an effect on the duckling body mass? Things like that. And so we brought him on. He was a grad student from the University of Alaska, and he was doing brood observations. So we would sit in towers and we would look for broods, and he'd document activities of the broods, and then he would take all sorts of measurements on the pond. So we were doing salinity, invertebrate samples, looking at pond substrate and all sorts of water chemistry stuff to look at if there was any sort of, what kind of relationships were there between the broods and the habitats that they were using, if there were any. And then we also did a huge effort in trying to get more information about climate change and how these storm tides are affecting the island, and what is the actual salinity gradient of the island. And so we put out a bunch of data loggers. And we put data loggers in tidal sloughs, and then this is a data logger that we put in one of the ponds that is actually influenced by a tidal slough. So at low tide, it's like this amazing mud flat that the shorebirds just go crazy for. And then when it's high tide, you get things like king eiders, and we would get all sorts of, this is where the common eiders and the speck eiders really like to hang out. So it was just a bird mecca when this pond was full. We also put data loggers in what we call closed ponds or freshwater ponds. So they weren't being influenced in any sort of way by any outside source, like a tidal slough or anything like that. So what exactly have we been finding about the eiders? Overall, what we found in this table, it's showing nest production in the green and then egg production in the red. And so what they've been seeing is that there have been these fluctuating years, but overall the population's been relatively stable. But in the last 10 years is where it's been really spectacular. They've been seeing this increase in the population size, which is a really positive thing, and that's what we're wanting to see, is that the population is doing really well. And so overall, what does this mean? Ultimately, what it means is that the eider population is actually reaching that threshold where they can start talking about delisting. But the main issue, again, is that there's 3 breeding habitats, and all 3 of those breeding habitats or breeding areas have got to meet the criteria. And right now, there's a couple of, like in Barrow, they're a little bit below one of the levels, and even Yukon Delta, depending upon the time frame you look at, if you look at 10 years, 15 years, the numbers will fluctuate. But the really exciting thing is that there's this potential for the species to eventually be delisted and actually have a stable growing population that we'll still have to continue to monitor, but hopefully not as extensively. So obviously there's going to be monitoring and other, there's still going to be surveys and stuff that are going to be going on to monitor the population.